Hi, this presentation is going to walk through using the Webform module for Drupal 8's access controls. My name is Jacob Rockowitz. I'm known as Jay Rockowitz on the web. I'm a Drupal developer and software architect. I built and maintain the Webform module for Drupal 8. So I want to start off with a very general definition of access control from Wikipedia. Access control is the selective restriction of access to a place or resource. The act of accessing may mean consuming, entering, or using. Permission to access a resource is called authorization. This is a general thing. It's kind of laying the land. And it's really, permission is the key thing. It's saying, what someone can do, how they can do it. And the who, we'll get into that because I want to start talking about web form permissions and roles. And permission roles allow you to globally control who, via users and roles, can do what, which is permission. What are you permitting them to do? And this is the UI for permissions in Drupal, and this is some of the web form permissions with the description. And you need to go explore this when you set up your site and walk through them. And here's a pretty exhaustive, this is the entire list of all the permissions available without descriptions. And descriptions definitely help define what's going on here. And I'm not going to walk through every permission, but I kind of want to break down types of permission. And this isn't exclusive to the web form module. This is just general, how permissions are generally set up in Drupal. And it's 5 groupings, and basically it's administer is like a super user. This person can do anything. There's super user where user 1 can do anything on the site, but you can also say someone's a web form administrator. And with those, someone's doing operations, there's this terminology called CRUD. It basically stands for create, read, update, and delete. These are all the actions someone takes to update information or manage information. And when you look at permissions, you'll see these words. In Drupal, instead of read, we tend to use view, but you'll see create a web form submission, view a web form submission, update a web form submission, or delete a web form submission. And along with these CRUD permissions, there's this concept of any or own. Any means you can access anything. So create, well, see, create, it's create is always specific to one person. A person can create something. But for view, you could do view any submission or view own submission. And the key thing about own is that's the author, the person who created the web form submission or the web form. That defines who's the owner. And when you use those view own or update own or delete own, that's what the way those permissions work. And the last two are kind of like extra things, and they're tied to kind of features. And like one of the typical ones is, giving someone permission to view the overview of all the web forms on the site. And it's usually used for views or lists of things. And that's usually dedicated permission so someone can get to that main list of web forms. And then there's these trusted features and functionality. And it's just like little nuanced features where you want to limit who can do these permissions and these actions. And in the web form module, the 3 that came to mind was YAML, being able to edit the YAML of a web form. One is very powerful and confusing to certain users, which is why it's a dedicated permission. Adding CSS and JavaScript to a web form is also not most users don't need to do it, and there are some security implications with that. And also with Twig, letting someone edit Twig templates within the UI. And that's how these permissions, when we get here, you start seeing that breakdown. These are the CRUD operations. This is the access of the overviews or listings, administer, and then these are those features, which is CSS, web, and Twig. So I'm going to keep moving forward, and this is just to break down how I view roles and when I set up my site. I kind of have these 4 categories when I'm setting up roles, and there's these global behaviors. So someone's an administrator, or they're a developer, or they're a publisher or reviewer, and that gives them just this ability on the entire site. And then I just do singular behaviors. Sometimes these get added to, you can combine multiple roles. So the most classic one is I'll create a role called publish, and when that's assigned to a user, they can publish their own content. But you could say users can create content, and that's what the next one is, where, well, there's managing a content type, where someone's an event administrator, and you create a role called events, and that role gives them full access to events. And then kind of below that, you could say someone can create an event, and that's where you're saying they can only, create an event, view their own event. And that's where you might combine the global behaviors, because you could combine it with a publish behavior that allows them to publish events. And you want to play with these, and these are just very broad concepts here about this is more than just web form. And the next slide really is like these are the common web form related user roles. You have an administrator, you have a submitter, that's a person who can create a submission, you have someone who can review a submission or reviewer, and a manager, which is someone who can go in and review all submissions or even bulk delete all the submissions. So we're going to get into some more specific stuff with the web form module and submission access. And the web form module provides this access tab, which allows you to control who, users and roles, can do what and where. So it's web form specific permissions. It's setting up access rules for a specific web form. And this is the UI. It's under settings. It's the last tab. And this is the first one. It's create submissions. And it defaults to anonymous users and authenticated users can create submissions. And those are the roles that are default. But you could say you want someone to log in and turn off anonymous and say they have to be authenticated. And the last two there is, and I'm going to just kind of put my mouse on it, is you can define users, specific users that can create submissions, and you can get into singular permissions. And these are all the access rules available on that tab: creating, viewing, updating, purging, which is the bulk deletion, and then you get into the own CRUD operations: view, update, delete. And then there is someone who can go in. You could say this single person is an administrator of the form and can go update it. And I did isolate testing, so you can say only certain users can test, which is generate dummy data and populate a form. And with the granting, web form access, we were using roles, which is absolutely the most common approach. You just take those roles that you have globally and you can apply them to your web form. And then you can do users for one-off approach, where this user can update this web form. And permissions is really an edge case where you might take, say, someone has view any event permission, therefore they can view the event registration form. I rarely use it. It's for edge cases, and sometimes you just get in these tricky scenarios. Now I'm going to move on. So we're talking about the web form, accessing a web form, and there's also web form element access. And web form element access allows you to control who can access and update a specific element. And we're on an element. This is the default contact form, and I'm just on the name field, but you see how the UI kind of follows through. There's an access tab, and you can decide who can access this element, enter and view it, when between creating a submission, updating a submission, or viewing a submission. And defaults to anonymous and authenticated because they can do it. But you could create, for example, under the update submission, you could say only administrators can edit this input, and that creates an admin only field. And types of element access, which I kind of walk through: create, view, and update. And there's this other little nuance feature which is called it's marking an element as private. And that means the element will only be shown to users with update any submission permission. And here's the UI for it. It's under Advanced, Administration, and it's a little checkbox. And does the same thing as that Access tab. It's just a little simpler. It's like a singular property that does this one extremely common behavior: creating an element only for administrators. Instead of having to track all that other stuff and set up all those roles, it's just a checkbox. And if the person is the owner or administrator of a form, they can edit that single element. So now we're going to get into the tricky part. So web forms can be applied to multiple nodes. That's a feature in D8 where you can take one singular web form and reuse it throughout your site. So you can create an event registration form and apply it to multiple events. And you can turn on the web form node module, and it makes it easy to do that and view individual results. So there's now a web form access module which really focuses on nodes, and the web form access module allows you to create a group of users who can access a web form node. So you're creating your own mini roles specifically for web forms. And I'm going to have to walk you through it. I'm going to, here's the UI. I'm going to give a demo, but I can break down this UI a little bit, where you're describing it, you're just saying what type of group this is, what users are associated with it, what nodes they can access, and what permissions they have when they can access that node. And types are very simple. It's kind of like a categorization. It's just saying that these groups are a certain type, like employee, manager. When I do the demo and you see how types are leveraged, it'll make a lot more sense. And these are the types of web form node access. So the groups, these are the permissions. These are exactly copied from what we looked at before. It's just isolating them, allowing you to kind of create a reusable group of them, of users with these permissions. And types we'll get into. And I'm going to go into a demo. It's a little tricky, so have some patience. The access module is turned on to dedicate a module called the web form access. It turns on this tab. I have demo the web form demo regional contact module turned on, which generates these examples. It helps you kind of understand how it works. So the way it works is the goal is to create a contact form that's regional specific for the United States. And there's 4 regions in the US: Midwest, Northeast, South, and the last one is the West Coast. And it's just a demo, but the idea is we create users, and there's 2 types of groups that are accessing these forms. These are managers or employees. And you can see how the permissions work, and they make a lot of sense. You can say a manager can administer submissions, that gives them full access. An employee can only view submissions or update submissions. They can't really delete them, and that's a key concept. You're like, they can review it, but they can't delete the data. I'm going to demo the manager one, and I have the masquerade module, which I recommend if you're doing any type of heavy access controls with users, because you can masquerade as a user. So I'm going to switch my account over to the demo region US Midwest manager. I'm going to click it. And there's this block that comes with the web form access module that shows you all the forms that you have access to through those access groups. And this manager has access to the United States Midwest contact form. I'm going to click over. And he has full access. They can create tests. They can view results. If we go over here, you'll see clear. I'm going to go over to the test tab. I'm just going to create one test submission. You can see it. And by the way, this shows you some email routing, which I'll get into, where it sends emails to specific user types. And now you're starting to see how types might work. So this is an email going to only employees. This is an email only going to managers, the generic managers. Basically, any managed person who's assigned a manager group that's assigned to this form will get an email. I'll show you the back end when we switch out. I'm going to unmasquerade so I can get back up to the tab. Go over here. Go back to our tab. What I kind of wanted to show is switching over to the employee. It's the same pattern. And I switch over. And there the user has access to this form, but you'll notice that there's no test tab. And the results are very limited to just viewing and downloading. No purging, no testing. I'm going to unmasquerade again. We're going to get into the types for a second because that's the key thing. Something, you know what, I'm going to jump to one quick thing is if I go to these nodes or I go to the users, so I'm on the node that has these access rules, and if I go over to edit, you can define them here. Quick, you can, as you're creating a web form node, you can say which groups can access it. When you create a user, you can say which access groups this user is a member of. And if I close out these tabs and I jump back up here and hit edit, you can say in this UI which users and nodes are associated. So there's a lot of opportunities to set this up and manage it in different ways. I hope that helps. You got to play with it. I always need to say that to people. But what I want to jump to and show you is types. So the demo regional contact form creates this demo region contact web form. We created that one submission. It's open. I'm going to jump over to settings. We go over to the handler. And so these are those emails when we did the tests we saw they're going out. And let's do the employee only. I'm going to click edit. And the key thing you want to be aware of is there's these new tokens, web form access type tokens. And so this cuts through all the groups. So if you had like 100 groups and all, whatever group is type employee, it'll pull the email addresses, aggregate them, sort them, alphabetical, remove duplicates, and send emails to all the employees, period, across all. That's an important thing to get and experiment with. And if you click browse, and I'm doing this also because if I click browse, you're going to see here's all the access tokens. And another feature that's been around for a while is you can also use role-specific access token, like role-specific tokens, so it pulls the email addresses for all the users assigned to this role. If you don't have the web form access module enabled, you can still use these roles. So if you say, If you create a reviewer role, you can send an email to all reviewers. By the way, all these access controls just depend on the scope and complexity of your site. The webform access module is really designed for complex but common use cases, regions. I've seen applications where basically every state has their own web form, and you want to control access to those individual web forms, and this web form access module makes that possible. Application systems where you have committees reviewing different forms. You can reuse the form over and over again and just create groups of people who can then access the results of that form. I know it's a lot to digest. I am going to continue forward. So we really walked through all the UI stuff in the webform module, and I want to talk about API access and how just a really important hook that everyone needs to be aware of. It's called hook entity type access. And this is a hook for developers where you can do anything you want in the access controls. And you could look at the three arguments. It passes the entity type, which in our cases, if you were doing a hook web form access or hook web form submission access, which is right here, I'll just highlight it. Whoops, sorry. You can decide what operations someone's allowed to use, and that's what the third argument is, the account. And gets into access results. This is stuff you have to read up on these APIs. And just to help move the, get you started, these are the common entity access operations, and they're CRUD: create, read, aka view, update, delete, and duplicate. And then when you get into web form access, and if you were to use that hook, you'd start seeing these other operations that get passed through to the module. And they're still following the same pattern, but they're more specific. Testing, administers, whether they're on a new web form, can they create a submission? Or they're in the admin view, can they view any submission, purge any, delete, etc. And these are all just help control different levels of access. And when you get to submission, you'll see basically these submission underscore operations propagate downward into individual submissions. View any, update any, delete any, purge any, same thing, view, own, delete. And this is a big beware. I like the awkwardness of this bubble, but so entity access hooks just don't affect views or entity lists. Those are queries of the database that just look at your records and return them. So if you go and tweak and say this user can't access this submission, when they get to the main list of submissions, they'll still be able to view it unless you write custom code to do it. And it's a little tricky nuance to how access rules are set up. And there are modules to help, and we're going to kind of move forward to that. So there's access control modules and references. And I just wanted to call out these two modules. Advanced access is really trying to address that views issue where it's setting up grant rules. It's like a database table to track permission to different submissions. And there is the group module. And if you're doing very complex things, the group module allows you to do this, like to create these groups across your whole site for all your content. And you can definitely use this in conjunction with the webform module. The webform access module is specifically designed to take the webform specific permissions, which are pretty nuanced, toward managing submissions and get them well organized and maintained. And there's a huge list of access control modules on Drupal.org that you can walk through and get more familiar with what's available. And just some references on Drupal.org. The user guide has great examples of users, roles, and permissions. I also want to throw out there that Drupalize Me is really good content that extends that and adds more to it. And Tag One Consulting just has a great blog post about access controls and how they work. And when they're talking about access controls, it's about the API stuff. So understanding what an access result is, how does it work, caching, which is something I haven't touched here. And if you're a developer, you're going to have to. And that's it. Check out my site, jrockwitz.com, and thanks for listening.